Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Once again, thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Dean, for allowing us the time to really understand how we can transcend our roles as advocates.
Education as a career. As both Danny and John mentioned, I was an economics major in my undergrad, and more specifically labor economics. I really thought that after I graduated with my undergrad, I'd go on to graduate school and get a graduate degree in labor economics and work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's what I really thought I was going to do for a very long time. But interestingly, after I graduated, I went to work for just in the administration of a company where the employees were in a union. They were mechanics. And because I was the only guy in the company who knew how to use Lotus 1, 2, 3, this is going back a long time, before Excel days, I was invited to the negotiating table. And my job was to cost proposals that the union was making. And so I sat at the bargaining table with my little, back in the day, a laptop wasn't a laptop, it was a very big thing. And I sat there, and if the union said we wanted to have a 50-cent an hour raise, I'd calculate how much that would cost the company. But I was fascinated by the process. And we had an attorney who was advising us at the time, who was a very good attorney, and he and I stayed close even after I graduated from law school. But he was a very good attorney, but he didn't work for the company. He came from a firm, and he got us a very good agreement for the company, but he was very, very aggressive and basically told these union mechanics that they weren't worth the money that they were asking for over and over and over again. And so we ended up with a good agreement. The union actually took it to a strike and lost. So we ended up settling on that basis. But we ended up with an inexpensive agreement, and then spent the next 3 years trying to improve labor relations because nobody was happy. So I was, I don't know, pretty young still, and just thought I could do it better than that. I thought there was a way to negotiate a union contract and still maintain morale and still let employees feel like they were part of the company. So I talked to that attorney about it. And he said, well, you don't need a graduate degree in economics to do that. You need a law degree. So that's why I decided to go to law school. I literally told my wife about 3 weeks after we got married that I decided I was going to go to law school. You can imagine that conversation. But anyway, she supported me through the whole thing. I went to Suffolk, as was mentioned, and graduated. While I was in law school, I got interested in the public sector. Still employment. I was always interested in the employment relationship. But I got very interested in the public sector, particularly around constitutional issues. You know, if you can't take the government out of the employer when you work for a government employer. There are issues of due process and search and seizure that simply don't exist in the private sector. I was also interested that in the public sector, for most part, unions cannot strike. And without the inability to strike, collective bargaining in some ways becomes collective begging, because the union just doesn't have the same weapons that it would have in the private sector. Suffolk at the time did not have a public sector labor law course. So my advisor suggested that I go to and do an internship at the Labor Relations Commission, which is now the Department of Labor Relations. So I went over and I did an internship for credit, and then later on volunteered there. The experience was just terrific. The Department of Labor Relations, or the the Labor Relations Commission, as it was then, is really the state version of the National Labor Relations Board. So they have jurisdiction over all public employees in Massachusetts. And so, but otherwise it's set up very similar to the National Labor Relations Board. They hear the same kinds of cases, but just it's police, fire, higher education, municipal teachers. So I went to work there first as an intern, as I said, and then I volunteered there. And all summer while I was studying for the bar exam, I volunteered there 1 day a week, just as a way to get away from studying for the bar. I just went in there and worked there for the day, and it was great. And then when I graduated, they offered me a job as a staff attorney. And later on, I had an opportunity to be an administrative law judge. I was that for about 8 years. And then before I left, I was commissioner. I can talk about this a little bit later on, but I just stayed and kind of went with the flow. You know, I volunteered over there, and then they asked me if I wanted to work there, and I just did what nobody else wanted to do as a staff attorney, and then really ended up, I think I'm still the only commissioner of labor that started off as a staff attorney. Usually they come in, because they're political appointments, they usually come in as commissioner and not go up through the ranks. But anyway, I stayed there until I was appointed by Governor Cellucci, and I stayed there until Governor Romney was elected. There was no way he was ever going to reappoint me, and so I had to go find a job, and I ended up going to UMass at the Boston campus. Started out in labor, but then I really got interested in public higher education. As John mentioned, I'm a product of public higher education, so I got really interested in public higher education, and just started to work in different areas. So I'm still very interested in labor. That's my go-to place. But started to work in other areas. As I think was mentioned, I was down here as chief financial officer for a while. I came back as HR, and now I have this job, at least for as long as they'll have me. So that's sort of my long road to where I was. Never thought I'd be here. Really thought I was going to be sitting in a cubicle someplace crunching labor numbers. But I just stayed nimble and just sort of went with it.
Great, thank you. Kind of a follow-up to that is question number 2. Your experience is as an advocate and as a lawyer in the traditional sense. How has your core training and your law degree assisted you in the positions you've had and your subsequent positions? And how can students take their experiences into leadership positions?
So, although when I was at the Labor Relations Commission and even at UMass, I did act as an advocate. I have acted as an advocate. I've represented both of those agencies, but I'm not really a traditional lawyer. But for me, the legal training wasn't as much about the law as it was about a way of thinking and about a way of really developing a skill for unpacking very complicated problems. When I was at the Labor Relations Commission, even as an intern, I often served as attorney of the day, they called it. So if somebody had a problem, there'd be a phone number you call up, and one of the lawyers in the office would pick up the phone. And that was great training, because people just want to tell you what's on their mind. They just want to tell you their problem. And maybe 25% of it's relevant to some sort of cause of action. And everything else is just everything that's going on. But being able to understand what's relevant, what's not relevant, what's important, what's not important. I think during my law school years, I really developed that skill. And that has helped me throughout my entire career in whatever role that I was in. Later on, I did some graduate work in dispute resolution, which made me a better neutral. I actually spent at the Labor Relations Commission, as I said, as a administrative law judge. Most of that work is in mediation. And the mediation training was just fabulous. I think it's great for all lawyers to have some sort of training as a neutral. One of the most interesting parts of the dispute resolution program was I had to volunteer to be a mediator in the small claims court. If you're not familiar with the small claims court, these are people who are white-knuckled over 40 bucks. They go in, they are angry, and somebody owes them 40 bucks. It used to be like $8 to file a claim. And so you go in, you file your claim, everybody represents themselves. You go before a magistrate, make your case, and the magistrate decides. And so we were there, people that were in my program, to volunteer to help the parties, who, by the way, did not want to mediate. They just wanted their day in court. So sometimes you had to convince them to mediation. But it's an absolute fabulous way to learn how to be a mediator, because, as I said, these people are very angry over very small dollars. I remember writing settlement agreements where somebody would agree to pay somebody $2 a month over the course of like 6 months because they owed them like 12 bucks or whatever the math is. It really was amazing. But, you know, and then just talking about, you know, taking those kinds of experience into leadership positions. So leadership really is both of those things. It's really being able to unpack very complicated problems and then working with the staff to create solutions. So in terms of your own experiences, everybody is the sum of all their prior experiences. So use it all, right? Every experience you have will be in there somewhere, and you'll need to draw on it in a variety of ways throughout your career.
Great. Thank you very much, Chancellor. The next question is kind of a subset of what you've already answered, but what can you say to students that may feel uncertain in their position and what their ability to change directions in their career? Certainly you change from labor commissioner to higher ed, but you know, what advice could you give to a student that wants to change directions in their career?
So I think you just have to take it as it comes. I think, you know, just putting my HR hat on for a minute, the experts say now that folks coming out of school are likely to have 5, 7, 10 jobs throughout their career, as opposed to the old days where, I mean, this is literally like my second job. I worked for the Commonwealth and I worked for UMass. And lots of people who have been around for a long time have had just one job. You know, you get your one job at IBM, you know, 25 years later you retire. That's not going to happen. There's far more movement. So be nimble and take it as it comes. That's, you know, that's what I did. I just sort of saw opportunities where I could. When I graduated from law school, there was a law firm in Boston called Gaston and Snow. John, you might remember them. Yeah. So there was about 1,200 people in that law firm that shut down about 3 months before I graduated from law school. So there were 1,200 lawyers with some of them as much as 10 or more years experience, willing to do what I wanted to do for about the same money that I was willing to work for. It was not an easy time to find a job. I had a stack of rejection letters when I was getting out of law school. And so I ended up volunteering. You know, volunteering these days, because of a much stricter reading of the Fair Labor Standards Act, is a little bit more difficult now. But I thought it was terrific because I volunteered at a place that gave me real work to do. As I said, I did things that nobody else wanted to do, so they were happy to have me there. I got to know tons of people who work in this area and picked up a lot of really good skills. And I got to spend time, you know, I had real work to do, which made me feel good, but I also had time to shadow attorneys in the office. I sat in on hearings. I sat in on meetings with commissioners. And I really learned how it all worked. So stay nimble, get as much experience as you can, and then just keep doing what interests you. And don't worry about where I'm going to be 12 years from now, because you can't predict where you're going to be 12 years from now.
Great, thank you. There's certainly a lot going on in society and in the political world. And so this question kind of speaks to being heard in the current environment. So given the plethora of issues facing today's society, can you speak to us about the importance of making your voice heard?
Yeah, sure. We certainly live in a complicated time, and we have become very, very polarized. When I was a mediator, I used to leave the parties together, so sort of kind of traditional mediation strategy is, you keep the parties in separate rooms, and you go in here and you say, what do you think? And then you go back over here and you say, what do you think? I didn't do that. I found that leaving the parties in the room together was actually very helpful, and I would leave them together as long as they were learning something from each other. Sometimes they would scream at each other, but I always used to say to them, even if the message is raw, filled with emotion, is that if there's something to be learned, let it go. Because that was really important to the other side. Because hearing what the other side has to say is just as important as being heard. And so, because the information that both sides picks up really is the foundation for common ground. So I think people need to be heard, and I think as leaders we have to figure out ways for people to be heard, but we also have to listen better. And so when you're in situations where you're representing a client or you're in that kind of a situation, and no one seems to be listening, just keep that in mind. That even if they're screaming at each other, because maybe the only message is, I'm really, really mad. But that's information too. So just use it. Just use the information.
Great, thank you. Building off of that discussion, could you please explain the importance of having equitable representation in advocacy? And what can we do to ensure holistic representation in boardrooms and executive offices?
So what I was just talking about being heard, well, not everybody has the ability to be heard. And I think that's where we come in as lawyers. So we have the power to speak for those who are really marginalized and really don't have a voice. So I think when it comes to equitable representation, and just a quick aside, so when I was an administrative law judge, the hardest thing to do was to deal with pro ses who came in. So I don't know if everybody on the call is a lawyer, but a pro se is somebody who is in a legal proceeding not represented by an attorney. They were the hardest folks to deal with because they didn't understand the procedure. They were often quite intimidated by lawyers on the other side. And so we had to do our best, although we were neutrals, we had to do our best to make sure that that their voice could be heard. But when you're representing somebody, obviously that's your job. But we do get to speak for those who are marginalized. And I think that's actually the best part about being a lawyer. I said before, I'm not really a traditional lawyer, but I do speak for others quite often. When I was in human resources, I used to say to people all the time, look, I represent the administration, but as a human resources director, I'm really there to advocate for the employee. So I would quite often speak for the employee that really just was not able to be heard. In terms of ensuring representation in executive offices and those kinds of places. Good decisions require perspectives. And so in our cabinet meetings, for example, if we have a decision to make, we have, John has government relations, and David Gingerella has administration and finance, and we have a provost who's in charge of academics, and we need all of those perspectives to be able to make good decisions. So, but in addition to subject matter experts, we need other perspectives as well. So we need to hear the voices of people of color and immigrants, for example, and women. And you can't have a boardroom that's so big that every perspective is there. So sometimes we have to take those perspectives from our everyday jobs where we run into different kinds of folks and try to bring those perspectives in. It's not an easy thing to do, but really the best decision is made when all those perspectives are taken into consideration. So, when you find yourself in a situation where you're managing or you're on a board, just keep that in mind. If you have a bunch of white males sitting around a boardroom, there's going to be a decision made from the perspective of a bunch of white males. And to be able to have other voices in there is really important. One of the things I've been doing, just because of my labor background, is in a lot of the meetings that we have, a lot of the committees we have, I've been inviting union leaders in to those meetings because I think it's good for us to hear from them. We met today with the clerical union. And there were moments during that meeting where the emotion was pretty raw too. But that's okay. That's good, solid, honest information that we needed to hear. So we try to do that as much as we can. So just keep that in mind, that you really do want to have all voices before you decide on the best decision.
Thank you. Next up, how can UMass Dartmouth as an educational institution make a difference in our local community?
Well, I think in a lot of ways we already are, and that's not new. I am clearly the product of public higher education. I'm quick to say I'm one of those who was the first in my family to go to college. Without UMass, I went to UMass Boston. Without UMass, I wouldn't have gone. Clearly the only place my family could afford. And I came from a family, I said I was the first in my family. Neither of my parents had gone to college. They didn't know the first thing about it. The idea of going to a big private college, they just wouldn't have been able to, do it. Not just the financial part of it, but the complications and some of the complications of a bigger private institution. UMass Boston at the time was very small, and it was very easy to get in there and to be able to find my way in there. It was still not easy. I have older brothers who went into the trades, and they had a very easy job that was easy to understand. Electrician, plumber, it was kind of a job that my parents could easily understand. I was studying economics. They had no idea what I was talking about. But nevertheless, as I said, I'm a product of public higher education. So it made a big difference for me. For our institution right now, so first we employ 1,000 people, most from our region. So we make a very big difference in our community because I think, John, we're probably the second biggest employer in the South Coast.
Yep, behind the hospital, yeah.
Yeah, so we are a very large employer, and we're a state agency, which means the benefits, the retirement benefits, the healthcare benefits that we offer our employees are really unmatched. Most of our students come from this area still. As we become a national university, we do recruit more nationally and even internationally, particularly on the graduate side. But still, the majority, particularly of our undergraduate students, come from this area. And many of them are like I was. They probably have no option. If they want to go to a university, they probably have no option but to go to the local state public university. And then we're also just very active in the community. I was talking with somebody today. We are in the public schools through Matt Roy's shop, the Ladue Center. We are in the public schools every day, I think virtually now, but we are all over the place. And I think there's clinics even in the law school, John, you could probably talk more about that, that I was on a tour when I worked at the campus a few years ago down in New Bedford, and there were, we went into a place and there were students from the business school helping community residents with their income taxes. So this is what universities do in their communities, and we continue to do that. A lot harder today, obviously, but we continue to do that. And John, some of the clinics that are in the law school, right? You want to talk about any of
Yep,
those?
absolutely. We've got the immigration clinic. Certainly that's a hot clinic with all that's going on in society. We've got a prosecutor's clinic with the local district attorney's office. We've got a small business clinic. We've got a tribal law clinic. And then we've got the open-ended field placement that students go out into the community. The law school over the last 10 years has done over 150,000 hours of community service, and annually through the Ladue Center, our entire campus does upwards of 200,000 hours in the community on many of the things that the Chancellor has mentioned, teaching American Reads program, this tax program. We've got students all over the place helping local nonprofits and businesses.
Yeah, so I think universities definitely have a place in their communities. And so, and look for those opportunities. You know, as an HR guy, I would say to employees all the time, you know, you have to be tenacious about your own career. And it's quite often, or I suppose early on, it will be, you won't have as many opportunities to gain that experience while somebody's paying you. So the idea of being out there helping in the community, but also picking up some really invaluable experience. And quite often, as I found when I volunteered while I was in law school, people will allow you to do things for free more than they will give you those same things to do for paying you for it. So it's a great way to pick up experience, but really be tenacious about your career. And if there's a gap, so I had a gap in my law school experience because I couldn't find a public sector labor law course. So I went out and found that experience just so I could put that in my toolbox. And that ended up, you know, as a place that I worked for about a decade. So definitely try to do those kinds of things.
So I think I know the answer to this next question, but we'll see what the Chancellor answers. Though you've recently been appointed as the Chancellor, what is the most pressing issue that you have encountered thus far?
Well, I think I could probably say a couple of things, but right now it all seems to come back to the budget. I think probably most of you know that because of COVID, and I say it comes back to the budget, so it'd be easy for me to say COVID, but right now COVID comes back to the budget. I think most of you know that because of the COVID situation, we have some tremendous financial challenges around our auxiliary revenues. So we typically have around 3,500, I think a little bit more than that, students on campus. We have 700. We really had to limit the number of students that could live on campus. We also anticipate that our state appropriation will be significantly down. So all in this year, I sound like a broken record. John's probably heard me say this 1,000 times. We started this fiscal year with about $32.5 million less than we started last year. And although some of our costs are variable, with only 700 students living on campus, obviously some of our like dining costs and those are variable. Many of our costs are not variable. And so trying to figure out a way to balance the budget has been very, very difficult. If John thought I was going to say unions, because I spend a lot of time with our unions, we have 5 unions. That's really my comfort zone. So I don't think I would say that has been a pressing issue. But they have their perspective. And as I said before, dealing with the unions for me is kind of my comfort zone because I'm very comfortable just listening to their perspective. And as I said before, the meeting this morning was pretty raw emotion. You know, people are afraid about their jobs. They're afraid for their families. They're afraid of getting sick. And they wanted to tell somebody about that. And so they told me. And that was okay. So, but really the most pressing thing has been the finances. I can't seem to have a conversation with the system office without them asking me about how we're going to balance the budget. I would very much like to be able to put that question to rest so we can get on with everything else that I think we need to do. Did I guess right? Did you guess right, John?
I did right. I was going to say COVID's impact on budget or just budget. So
Yeah.
I win a prize. The next question is kind of a subset of that. With your background in conflict resolution, how have you been able to take your experience into resolving these issues that you're currently facing in your new position?
Yeah, so, you know, kind of the same as I said before. There's really two, I think just making sure that you hear from everybody. My mediation experience taught me that. And then lots of us want to be problem solvers. But the best solution is not always the first solution, even if that might be a solution. So don't be quick. And I used to say this to the parties when I was mediating. Don't be quick just to go to the middle, right? So one says, I'll pay 10. The other says, I want 30. And the very quick thing for the mediator to say is, why don't you guys just agree on 20? That's not always the best solution. It's more complicated than that. So don't always just jump to the middle as that's going to be the best solution. So that's about mediation. Not everything's about mediation, but just when you have a problem, look for a variety of solutions and then kind of play it out and see which is the best solution. And sometimes just knowing all of the alternatives and letting everybody know what they are, because some of those alternatives are a lot worse, will help you move folks in the right direction. So we're talking with the unions now about a variety of things that we can do to try to close the budget gap. And I'm being very open and honest about some of the alternatives we have. And some of them are not attractive at all because, you know, we're about 70% personnel costs. If we have a $32 million budget gap, the easiest thing to do, like many, many companies around the country have done, is to eliminate staff. That is not the best way for us to plan going forward. Our staff are not all variable based on the number of students we have. By the way, even though our auxiliary revenue is down because of the number of residents, our enrollment is not down. We have nearly the same number of students this year as we did last year. I know in the law school we're actually way up, we're up pretty much across the board on the graduate side. We're a little behind on the undergraduate side. So the answer for us was not to simply eliminate staff. The answer for us is to keep the staff, because we need them to serve the students and to be able to plan for future students. To make this an attractive university, we really do have to take care of the students. But when working with the unions, letting them know what the worst alternative is helped me to move them in the direction that we really need to move in, and that's to come up with workable solutions. So as I said before, I recommend conflict resolution training to anybody, particularly in the legal field. It has helped me in every position I have been in. So anyway, there you go.
All right, this is the last prepared question that I have, and then we'll see if people want to ask any questions through the chat. But public interest is a broad study that encompasses daily life. As a public interest flagship, can you speak on the importance of advocating in a public interest sphere and how we can incorporate those thoughts in making thoughtful, everyday decisions?
Well, I think really this is a good last question, because it really kind of sums up a lot of the things we've been talking about. I think public interest is so many voices. And so I think we really need to hear all those voices and advocate for those voices that cannot be heard. I think that's what we do. Because in order to make, I've said this before, but in order to make the best decisions, we have to make those decisions based in part on all those voices, including those voices that cannot be heard. I mentioned before, we have 1,000 people who work here, and our financial plan will impact all of them. And so we need to hear from them. We're listening to as many people as we possibly can and trying to come up with the best solutions we can. And that goes for really any of it. I mean, I'm looking very much internally at the university right now, but I'm also talking with people in the community about the university's role, and really trying to listen to the needs of the community and make sure that we can really address those. And so, as I said, to make the best decision, you really want to know the impact of that decision on everybody. And the only way to really do that is to talk to as many people as you want. So I think when we're talking about the public interest, we're really talking about literally the interests of everybody in the public. And so to get out there and hear those voices and let them then influence your decision.
Great, excellent. So I'm going to open it up. We've got a few more minutes for questions. So if you wanted to ask a question in the chat, I see we've got one, and then we could maybe ask the Chancellor to kind of sum up, but this has gone very well. I think we've got a lot of good information from the Chancellor and his views and background. So question in the chat: how can people in STEM utilize their skills to advocate for others?
I think there's a variety of ways you can do that, particularly in education, in the public schools, advocating for funding for additional STEM education in the lower grades, particularly. We find, I think a lot of people to university find that some of the students that come to university are not as well prepared. And so people who do have that STEM background really could advocate for more funding and even teacher education and teacher training in the public schools to allow them to be able to teach better STEM education in the public schools.
Great, thank you. I see no other questions in the chat. So Chancellor, maybe you could sum up a little bit, and then I'll turn it back over to Danny for some closing comments.
Great. I don't really have let me just start off by saying, we started saying, what was your career path? Never thought I'd be doing this. Never thought I'd be talking to graduate students, trying to offer words of wisdom. All I can say is, sort of in sum, is some of the things that I've already said is, be absolutely tenacious about your own career. No one's going to give it to you. Do whatever you have to do. Go and do what's interesting and be nimble. Pick up as many tools as you can, and that'll serve you well. As you start to think about your career as you go forward, and don't be afraid of changing. I thought I was going to work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and here I am. So you will come across opportunities to change, and just do what's right at the time. So listen to as many voices as you can. And if people don't have a voice, that's where we come in as attorneys. We can give them the voices they don't have. So anyway, I guess that's it in summary.
Great, thank you very much. I got one late question that came in. If you didn't mind answering it, I apologize, came in late, but how can graduate students best advocate for ourselves, like higher stipends, health insurance, etc.? I know you've kind of answered it in some of your general answers, but I just wanted to make sure everybody was heard here.
Yeah, so this one is pretty specific, and so I think graduate students can advocate for themselves through the Graduate Student Senate, through there's also an advisor. I think it's Ben Alex, although I think Alex is going to be going on sabbatical, so there may be a different advisor. Because graduate students do have interests different from undergraduate students. And I see there's a comment about how some of the other campuses, the graduate students are in a union. I used to negotiate with those unions. They've been helpful in a lot of ways. If that's a direction to go, but I think that just being heard is the most important thing. I wasn't around when those unions were formed, so I'm not entirely sure why, but usually I can tell you the reason that unions get formed is because employees feel like that no one's listening to them. And so demand to be heard. I did talk to Danny about getting somebody down to talk to you all about the health insurance. So we'll definitely work on that. I think I reached out to the person up in the president's office who manages the insurances. So we can definitely get answers to questions, but demand to be heard. And if the administration won't hear you, and the only thing you can do is form a union, then it's the administration's fault, including me. So just demand to be heard.
Got one more final question. What can we do to support international students?
Well, international students right now we're in a tough situation right now with international students. We have an administration, I don't want to get political, but we have an administration that is not particularly supportive. So I think knowing what the laws are, we have a terrific resource at the president's office, an attorney named Sandra Torres. She is our immigration attorney. She is a great resource, and she has at least one person, I think, working for her. She can really answer a lot of questions. And we have a good Daniel, now his last name is escaping me, in the Student Scholar Office, International Student Scholar Office, I think it's called, who's also a great resource. So I think what we need to do is make sure the international students know where those resources are, and that we can help make those connections and try to get answers to questions, particularly because the rules seem to keep changing. But Sandra wakes up every day thinking about what those rules are. So she'll really be able to help.
Great. That's our last question. So again, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Danny for a couple of closing announcements or comments and any announcements. So it's all yours, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Preble. Thank you, Dean Quinn, for this amazing conversation. I know everybody, I know I took away a lot from it. I'm sure my colleagues did as well. To some of the points that were brought up, thank you guys for the questions. September 23rd, it will be a busy day for the Graduate Student Senate. We'll be holding our second speaker series, which is Women in STEM, Bridging the Gap, where we'll have representatives from the board of directors from the American Chemical Society, and 2 executives from Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. So we hope that you guys will join us on the 23rd at 4:30 p.m. Look for forthcoming information. To the point, Chancellor, thank you for the health insurance comment. That same day, September 23rd at 1 p.m. is the time that we'll be having that town hall, which you should be receiving more information on that too. So without any more questions or any more objections, I'm going to thank you guys again. We hope everybody's well, and I wish you all well. And I look forward to seeing everyone the 23rd.